I myself have a handful of trans friends, and they share different opinions on the Harry Potter issue, so it is definitely a complex issue. Ultimately, I want to be as supportive as possible. Let me be clear, in no way do I support or agree with Rowling.
So, according to the quote that you heard at the beginning, I think the takeaway should be that, we're all individuals, there's 8 billion of us here on Earth, and we are all complicated and nuanced. And can there really be a system overlooking all of this? If we are all so complex and different, can you really group people together if everybody is so complex and nuanced? No, so that's it. Thank you for coming to our TED Talk. See you in the next video. That's it. Good night. Let me explain to you the story behind that one-off quote. Since 2023, I have called out Dr. Angela Puka because she unapologetically shares Harry Potter content. And when she's been called out by trans people, including myself, about there's really no way to support Harry Potter and not support J.K. Rowling, if nothing else, because J.K. Rowling has openly said, I use every penny that I get from the Harry Potter franchise to actually make the life of trans people impossible. It is documented. She invested, I think, last time, 70,000 of her own pounds paid by merchandise of Harry Potter to actually get the UK Supreme Court ruling to say that trans women are not women, but also trans men are not men, but they're not women, but they're not nothing. Basically, you need to not exist. We made a video essay about that. You might want to look into that. The amazing thing about this is that at any point, Angela could have just apologized and deleted the post about Harry Potter, and it would have ended. And we will discuss more about that during the video, where power lays. But in short, yes, I've been vocal about calling out Angela on that. Why? Because I've tried to approach her amicably, and she absolutely denied any wrongdoing, and actually went and doubled down on it, letting TERFs rip into me repeatedly. So my stance on Angela has always been clear. And I've been vocal about it, and you know about it. And other content creators in the Witchtube community also know about it. Last year, in one of those communities where a lot of Witchtube content creators are to just talk with each other and discuss possible collaborations and things that happen, share our expertise, because we basically are colleagues. On that place, I shared about Angela doubling down once again after 2 years from the first time, because a publisher talked about the book that was out of hers. In the comments, I said, hey people, remember that Angela supports Harry Potter, and anyone supporting Harry Potter, whether they like it or not, are also supporting the transphobic attacks on trans people, because it's documented. The money that goes into Harry Potter go directly into the pockets of J.K. Rowling, and she uses them against the rights of trans people. That's not up for debate, it's just observable. And because once again she doubled down, I mentioned to the people that were in this space with me, hey, if you're keeping score, this is what Angela does. She still refuses to step back, she still refuses to just stop sharing about Harry Potter, which in fairness has nothing to do with her practice or her channel. She could very easily stop and say sorry, and everything would be fine. But no, this time she doubled down saying, I cannot be transphobic because I teach queer theory in university. Apart from the fact that this is verifiably not the case or not on those terms, according to public record, she has done one lecture about queer people in paganism, and it's not the first time that Angela does that either, because she has done panels about people of color in witchcraft without any people of color on the panel. When I share these in this space with other Witchtube content creators, I get someone replying with a comment that also had that quote that you heard at the beginning.
I myself have a handful of trans friends, and they share different opinions on the Harry Potter issue, so it is definitely a complex issue. Ultimately, I want to be as supportive as possible. Let me be clear, in no way do I support or agree with Rowling.
Their point was that they had a collaboration with Angela that was about to come out in not even a week. And so hearing this information about Angela made them think, but also made them decide, I have trans friends. It's a complicated issue. So I will do nothing. Which actually is not nothing. They still publish this video in collaboration with Angela, which therefore supports what Angela does. You give legitimacy when you share space uncritically with someone. Imagine being in my position when I hear someone telling me I have trans friends and they say Harry Potter is fine. It's a complicated issue. It reminded me how important it is to make a distinction. And this is the point. Despite what it sounds like gossip here, hopefully that lured you in to be interested. The point of discussion here is not the gossip, is not who did that, which is why I'm not sharing the names, but it's how do you decide who to listen to when people that are part of the same marginalized group say two opposite things. Specifically, in this case, it would be trans people like me and my wife Raven saying, no, sharing Harry Potter verifiably supports transphobia. And this other person saying, oh, my friends are okay with Harry Potter, and they are trans. Who's right here? Who do you listen to? Is there even a point if they hold opposite views, being part and supposedly experiencing the same kind of marginalization in the world? Is there a rule? Is there some kind of process that we can extrapolate to understand why two people sharing the same marginalization can have such different opposing opinions, and ultimately, who's right, who needs protection and who doesn't? Because that seems to be the point at the end of the day, isn't it? It's about oppression. So are you oppressed, or are you making a fuss because other people are fine with what's happening, really? Harry Potter is not an issue for some trans people, so why are most trans people making a fuss about it? To get into this discussion, I think it's useful to understand some foundations. I don't like to have to go into theory. It sounds so elitist, so I'm going to make it as simple as possible because I wouldn't waste time on things that sound too theoretical when the point is our life out there, really. So, identity politics, where does it come from? What's the point of it? So the first time that the term identity politics showed up in literature was in the Combahee River collective statement in the 1970s.
This focusing upon our own oppression is embodied in the concept of identity politics. We believe that the most profound and potentially most radical politics come directly out of our own identity, as opposed to working to end somebody else's oppression.
Which was a black feminist collective that was basically trying to understand why the situation and the condition of black women and black lesbians was not addressed by all the liberation movements that started in the 60s. And the premise of it was that the personal is political. What we understand the most about the world is about how the world affects us, and therefore through our identity, which really is the foundation of intersectionality. Intersectionality came over a decade later as a theory. But realistically is, how does life, how does the system impact me? And then through that, we basically extrapolate, is it because it's racism? Is it because of class? Is it because of sexism? It's all those things, and you understand how those affect you through your lived experience. That was the point of identity politics. It was the importance of listening to the lived experience and how an experience is impacted by the things that happen in the world, and then sort of retroactively trying to understand what kind of thing in this system made this happen? Why are women treated worse than men? Why do they have less rights? And why do black women have less rights than white women? And so on and so forth. So it started always from personal experience, which, if you think about it, it's something that thankfully we still carry through when we say believe victims, believe their experience. Then it's interesting to see what victim we decide to listen to and what others we need to get all the names from the Epstein files and still not make any connections there. But, you know, the concept, completely fair. It started off with the idea of let's listen to the experience, the lived experience of the most marginalized. So, for example, when I introduce myself in different contexts, especially when I'm speaker in things, and I tell you that I'm a fat, queer, autistic, immigrant witch of color, I'm basically telling you with those labels what are the experiences that I come from, the system that I interacted with, and the kind of oppression that I've experienced for those different reasons. And then admittedly, on top of that, I have developed an understanding of the framework of references of those. So why is not just me experiencing something from, ignorant children if they throw banana peels at me. Why that is not just a personal experience, but it becomes a manifestation of racism of these children towards me, and so on and so forth. So from your experience, you get a chance to extrapolate, is there an overarching rule that connects my experience to other people's experiences? Is there a system that enables this? That is how, without necessarily just going into theory and books, and that's how you learn things, that's how actually you understand the experience of marginalized people. And that's not to say that my experiences are universal, but when you observe them, there is at times a rule to be extrapolated. And that's what we're trying to do in this video, basically. So when identity politics starts and is based on experience, starts for a very good reason there. Where does it get lost along the way? Because, when Black feminists start on something, because of the position that Black women occupy in society, especially in American society, being so low, there's always been the idea, especially in the Combahee River Collective, they had this understanding of, hey, we say that we need liberation because if Black women get liberation, Black lesbians get liberation, we're basically at the lowest strata of population. If we get liberation, everybody above us has been liberated. So really, it's in everybody's interest here. So that was a good start. And then, I don't know if you've noticed, but if you are a progressive white person, you've definitely had this feeling before. You say something about a theme of oppression, and somebody else will tell you, oh, what about this? Oh, have you thought about that? What experience do you have of that to talk about it? I don't think you should talk about things that you don't know. And it seems steeped in reality. I don't know, if you don't have experience of being, in the case of my experience, racialized in Italy, do you really know about racism in Italy? Can you speak about racism in Italy? You might have read books, but you have a theoretical knowledge, not practical, and experience must matter. But where did it all go wrong? So for instance, from my position, I can tell you from experience about racism in Italy, which is a very peculiar subject because people do not perceive Italy to be racist. It's a Western, modern country. But because through my experience, I was like, no, this must be, then that actually encouraged me to understand my own condition, to research and understand what was the premise upon which Italy could be that racist and also get away with it. Which then made me realize that Italy had a colonial past that we don't study in school because it's considered finished with the fact that Italy lost World War II, and so on and so forth. There were never reparations done to Libya and the Horn of Africa. So all those things are not discussed, but they're still pervasive in the culture in the sense of superiority of white people. I experienced it, but I could not explain to you why until I put my experience together with understanding, through the work of Angelo Del Boca mainly, that the colonial past of Italy is still strongly there, and those beliefs have never been overwritten with something different because we didn't have the immigration to the motherland that the UK and France had in the 70s. So those things you start to see, experience and then theory, they come together and you get a view of how the world is actually working and why it's working that way. However, let me try and say it in less words. So this is usually an attack that is being pushed against white progressive people. Why? Because white people hold authority. If they say something, people will have to listen. So what do you do to shut up white progressive people to stand on the side of the marginalized? Well, you use against them the same kind of principle that it's used against anybody that isn't progressive by saying, why don't you listen to the experience? Why don't you listen to victims? That way, conservatives can shut up at the same time the marginalized and the white people that will stand on their side. How do I know this? Well, actually, the right example of my experience is when I say about my racialized experience in Italy to Italian white people that don't want to listen, they will tell me that I'm lying, that they are friends with people of color, they never had that experience, so clearly I am lying. At the same time, if a white person then stands on my side by saying, but this experience is real, these things happen, we have this history, they will just say, well, you have no authority to speak because you don't have the first-hand experience. It's a catch-22 to shut up anything that is progressive, to actually listen to people that have a different experience and that are oppressed by the system. Why? Because usually conservatives don't want the system to change. There's a fundamental issue with identity politics having been co-opted by conservatives and therefore the right. Am I being crazy? Aren't right-wing people calling us woke and snowflakes? Which is actually, in fact, very ironic, and I'll show you why in a second. The concept of snowflake is that everybody is unique. And the fundamental of conservatism is liberal individualism. We are not part of society. We are all beautiful individual people, snowflakes. 8 billion of us, there is no point in flattening our experience and putting it together with people that maybe share one thing with us, but then we don't necessarily share all that experience. No, there are 8 billion different experiences, and trying to group them into categories that might be marginalized makes no sense. And therefore, the lie of capitalism that tells us it's all down to your hard work. What you get and what you don't get in this system is down to you. You're one of 8 billion, and you could be the one that makes it. There's nothing of your identity that stops you from that. If you deny the existence of shared experience by categories that is reinforced by a system that enables some people being oppressed, then you have automatically erased the foundation of maybe the system needs to change. You deny that that exists altogether, and you do that by elevating the individual and the individual experience. And you know where we see that very, very well, and it might be an example that actually makes it easier to understand. In choice feminism.
Understood as an orientation, choice feminism has 3 important features. First, it understands freedom as the capacity to make individual choices, and oppression as the inability to choose. Consequently, as long as a woman can say that she has chosen to do something, it is considered by choice feminists to be an expression of her liberation. Second, since the only criterion for evaluating women's freedom is individual choice, we should abstain from judging the content of the choices women make. It is definitionally impossible for a woman to choose her own oppression. All choices she makes are equally expressions of her freedom, and therefore equally to be supported. Finally, this view of freedom is supported by a particular historical narrative. It is the women's movement in the past that has made it possible for women to make free choices in the present.
Now, try to replace the word feminism with any other kind of philosophy about the marginalization. Say, imperialism, so the choice of some going and conquering and colonizing. It's fine if it, I don't know, serves the civilized West, bringing in and educating savages from, I don't know, the Middle East, maybe Iran.
In the protests following Mahsa Amini's death, while under the custody of the Iranian authorities, a wave of swift public protests spread. These protests consisted of women defiantly removing and burning their headscarves, cutting their hair, and boldly confronting and fighting against the forces of the authorities. The government, in response, resorted to internet restrictions and shutdowns to stifle the organization of further protests and stop the local leaders. The protesters instead resorted to TV, where the foreign oppositions later spread the rallying cry, "Women, Life, Freedom," symbolizing the essence of this rapid and transformative movement. Since the Iranian Revolution of 1979, these protests presented the most immediate challenge to Iran's regime. In February 2023, 20 independent Iranian trade unions, feminist groups, and student organizations issued a 12-point manifesto. It articulated and elaborated on the meaning of the slogan, "Women, Life, Freedom," seeking an end to oppression, discrimination, tyranny, and dictatorship.
The Manifesto for Minimum Demands of Independent Trade Union and Civil Organization of Iran cover women's, LGBTQ and workers' rights, demanding a separation of secular state from religion. It also clearly states its rejection of the monarchy reinstatement that the Iranian diaspora pushed for.
As a revolutionary document, the manifesto points out the fact that many individuals and entities have benefited from the corruption and the looting of the Iranian people's resources and wealth over the years. As such, they should be returned to their real owners and spent on rebuilding the educational, health, and environmental infrastructure, particularly in areas disadvantaged under both the Islamic Republic and Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi's regime.
So the revolutionaries currently in Iran, they want a more progressive Iran, don't want such progress conflated with the corrupt monarchy the diaspora would see reinstated, nor would let the US or Israel take control or destroy the Iranian people's resources, such as oil and gas that have been current targets at the ends of the US and Israel, along with children's schools. Maybe, being under a terribly, extremist regime, certainly the choice imperialism there is to think, well, this regime is so bad that anything and everyone will be fine as long as they take this down, even the imperialism of the US and Israel. And you hear this and you don't feel like you can say anything. You know that it's wrong, but especially if you're a white person, you're like, if I move, I'm going to be called a racist, I'm going to be called... So you know what? I'm just going to stay silent. Which is what realistically fucks up progressives, the priority that what people give to their purity. Reflect on that if you're white. If we apply choice feminism and its paradigm to anything else, whether it's racialization, whether it's colonialism, you start to see why it has become so easy for the right to do awful things, and then the way that it gets to wash off any kind of criticism is by putting at the forefront of a terrible racist policy a person of color. Because therefore, going along with the fundamentals of choice feminism, if you replace again feminism with race, you get that it becomes definitionally impossible for a person of color to choose their own oppression. Therefore, all the choices they make about racialization or racialized people cannot be racist because they could never make a choice that is basically against themselves. And that's how you get people like Shabana Mahmood tokenizing themselves in the name of white supremacy, promoting policies that are actively racist against current people that would seek asylum in the UK, people that could have been her parents back in the 60s and 70s. But she's already here. These policies are not actually going to affect her. So she can say that because she's a brown person, how can you tell me that I ever do something racist? I grew up being called the P word. But none of the policies that she is enacting in service of the white supremacist Labour government at the moment are actually choices that she will need to deal with the consequences of because she's already in a safe place. And have you noticed how most people hailing the bombs over Iran and telling you, you don't speak about the country I left, are indeed the diaspora? Do you start to see the effect of the consequences of those choices and claims? And when you claim not to be racist because you have been at the receiving end of racism, so you couldn't possibly ever do something racist, that is a false equivalence. It doesn't work like that if you are not in the position to be subject to the consequences of your own policy enacted. And guess what? None of the Iranian diaspora have bombs rained on their heads. They don't have to deal with those consequences, so their choices of what's best for the country they left, it's much easier than the one of Iranian people still in Iran. I think a great example to give you an idea of these things that make especially white people very uncomfortable, despite how good they want to be. They want to be progressive, they want to understand, and then there are these catch-22 arguments that they are just like, you know what, just in case, I'm not going to touch this with a poke stick, and therefore I will remove the epistemic authority that I have being white to actually support a stance. Because I don't really understand, there are stances that are opposite, and people of the same category have opposite view, and I don't want to risk being wrong, basically. And at the same time, they will go, oh, but I don't want to just ask people to be tokenistic, so just in case, I will invite no one with this experience to talk about it. I'll just ignore that this issue exists. And you know what a great example of this is? Veiling, which also accidentally applies to the witchcraft community, because a lot of people in the witchcraft community do veil for supposedly religious reasons. And I think we should inquire as to why we think that that's respectful to our deities or it's protective for us to do. Because also veiling usually is for femmes. And why is that?
Let's talk about the veil. Regimes that ban the veil, or really any forms of cultural expression, especially those of religious or ethnic minorities, are always in the wrong. Such laws are nothing more than a way to criminalize being a visible member of certain communities and do nothing to advance the cause of a single, multiply marginalized woman anywhere. At best, they deny women autonomy, and at worst, they create a no-win situation for those who were never given the option to choose and have to risk incurring the wrath of either their own communities or the state. These unjust laws are an example of how the women of marginalized communities are singled out for humiliation, and how their bodies are transformed into a battleground, a site for opposing patriarchal interests to vie for supremacy. That said, refusing to be critical of non-Western cultural practices simply because they are non-Western cultural practices is the height of anti-intellectualism. Whether we're talking about white feminists who approach the topic with apprehension due to how much it has been poisoned by racists, or non-white feminists who would rather remain silent than risk their culture looking bad, we see that people are happier to cede ground than stick their necks out for their espoused principles. So I'm just going to say with my whole out-of-lane ex-Hindu chest, I think veiling is bad. I think that modesty culture is inherently rooted in treating women's bodies as sexual commodities, and that neither religion nor tradition are adequate justifications for misogynistic practices. It's that straightforward. What if it's their choice? Then I can't do anything about it. Though that begs the question, how do you feel about the fact that under regimes the world over, women cannot choose? What if it's not their choice and it's forced upon them anyway? Are you willing to assert that that's wrong?
I think something very interesting that Talia Bhatt also brings out, and I think it's in another essay, but it's worth bringing up. It's when you have people from the same culture, from the same marginalization, stating two opposites, it is important to analyze where the actual person stands, what is their position, what is their interest, what is their power even. Because sometimes to stand up to the hegemony of the West, which is something to stand up against, there is a ricochet effect in going and justifying very conservative stances of some cultures just because they exist in opposition to the West, denying the fact that a lot of culture have something like patriarchy embedded into it. It's not necessarily something that the colonizers brought with them, not everywhere at least. It's something that Talia knows firsthand from her experience being raised in India, and the romantic orientalistic idea that we have in the West about the transliberation of India because there are people like the Hijra. Isn't that so progressive and anti-patriarchal? Goodness me, go read Transrat Femme by Talia. Even just the first few essays give you an idea as someone that was basically born in that culture. Then no, don't worry. Patriarchy was well baked into it and was well used to still oppress people within it. But from the West, we have this oriental look on things, that if it's not the West, then there is some purity to it because it's still young and therefore savage in a way. Orientalism by Said, it's his own book. It's linked down in the description below as well. Oyeronke Oyoumi is a great example of this because despite the supposedly post-colonial studies of Africa that she brings very interestingly to the scholar side of things, in the effort to prop up her culture against Western hegemony, she tries to go away and saying that, you know what, stuff like female genital mutilation, you think it's bad just because you apply a Western lens on it. And you know, it's part of our tradition and culture.
The insistence on the part of Western women to label what African women call female circumcision mutilation was the first visible sign of deep divisions between them and many of their African counterparts. A number of other African institutions that Westerners view as barbaric include arranged marriages, levirate, and child betrothal. These practices are misrepresented as misogynistic and not placed in their cultural and social contexts that would allow Westerners to discern their meaning from the perspective of African societies.
And consider that her theory is very, very well looked at by everybody that likes the idea of finding queer sources that are pre-colonial, because supposedly through her research it shows that the Yoruba people didn't quite have a sense of gender as we have in the West, which is upheld as an idea of see, it's just because we had patriarchy and patriarchy is wrong, we invented that with whiteness and it's the problem of the West and we should take a leaf from this. And when you present it, and this is the base, when you bring in something like, you know what, also patriarchy is done wrong, you've come with the lens of patriarchy to look at our practices, I don't know, female genital mutilation, and you've decided that that's bad, but actually it's culturally fine for us. It's our choice. Choice feminism, choice imperialism, choice female genital mutilation, choice arranged marriage, and choice child brides. Thankfully, as Taliabat contextualizes, there are elements at play for this bizarre partiality to something that, you don't necessarily need much of a cultural lens to understand that mutilating a girl that cannot consent is not something good, no matter the lens you put on it. Forcing a girl that cannot consent to marry, not a good spin on it. No culture can put a good spin on it. But white people are afraid to say that in the face of a black feminist woman that has done so much scholarly research. And then Talia thankfully contextualizes and says, wait a second, she has a slight vested interest in maintaining that her culture is actually valid. Why? Because she's a fucking princess of her own region in Nigeria. And so...
Oyewumi explains that she was born into a large family, and in 1973, her father ascended the throne to become the Sun of Ogbomoso. She also says that she is indebted to her siblings, parents, and the many mothers and fathers in the palace for their contributions to her many years of research.
And so, it is kind of in her interest to make her culture pass for valid in opposition to Western and validating it in some ways. And you need to understand those things about the people that say things so that you understand their vested interest. And ultimately, we need to understand who gains and who loses. And in her case, she gains from validation of this culture. So when she starts saying that FGM and child brides are okay, you have a right to feel in your stomach there's something off. And just because she talks from a culture that you don't know, that's not enough to shut you up. You need to have the courage to say, consent still applies to everyone. A child in any other country still has the same mental development. Are you really going to sacrifice them and defending them just because you're so afraid of being called a racist?
The West's relationship to the Third World remains a deeply Orientalist one, even amongst those who are more aware of social ills, perhaps especially amongst such people. The idea that an entire unfamiliar world exists past colonized borders is incredibly enticing. What can these strange and faraway people and places that I know very little about and refuse to look at objectively teach me about a better, less rigid, less Western way of life? Maybe I should listen to this charlatan who is trying to push a very particular narrative. It would be racist of me not to, right? Well, folks, swallowing whatever bullshit someone with a particular outlook and interest sells you isn't exactly egalitarian and decolonial.
Basically, all of this is to instill fear in the white progressives that when you know something from theory and not practice and not experience, you should not talk. Why is that? There's other white people basically from the right instead, that want to shut up, mainly white people. Why is that? Because white people are the only one that others and academia and the status quo listens to. If as a white person you take on the case of trans brown people, they are going to listen to you, not necessarily to me. Have you noticed the lack in academia that there is of actually people that represent their own marginalization from that experience? Why are they not allowed to bring their experience into academia? And in a second, Raven is going to explain to you more why. The accusation that these white people are given, and sometimes, there is a grain of truth, but then you need to be able to see it and criticize it back, because if the accusation to the progressive left is that when you categorize things too theoretically, then you flatten the experience of people, which is a fair criticism to them, then that's why then we say you invite the voices of these people and these experiences to speak. Possibly you don't just invite those that would already validate and agree with your opinion. Because otherwise we get people saying, oh no, I have trans friends that are okay with Harry Potter. And with the same line we could go, yes, there's Blair White and Brianna Wu who think that also trans people should not exist, but not them, because they are part of the kind of femininity that patriarchy demands of them. And so as long as they pass, they're fine. They're not actually in reality. Like, both of them are starting to see, I think Blair had to move to California from Texas because by pushing all the conservatives' laws and promoting them and trying to be there, they don't understand that they're not going to be spared. But to a degree, the longer you tokenize yourself for the people in power, the more you bargain with power, the longer you buy yourself time. They are still very short-sighted, but they have bought themselves some time. So people do criticize identity politics with the accusation that it flattens the experience of different people just because they share one category. But there is actually a term for that when it actually happens, and that is identitarianism. And to a degree, we actually do that in the witchcraft community. I don't know if you've ever noticed the kind of belief that we had that before Enlightenment, everything was fine and there were, the Dianic cults that survived everything. Wicca is based on the belief that it is what was saved from Dianic cults that survived throughout Christianity for almost 2,000 years without being ever stomped down and being the original thing, and how everything was better before colonialism. There were no problems. There was so much gender variation. Now, to a degree, there are these pockets that you look and you're like, well, we don't have two spirits here. We don't have Idras here. But then you look and listen to someone that is a scholar and has experience of that, like, again, Talia Bat in the case of the Idras. And you discover that, no, patriarchy was there all along. Don't worry. And the fact that we put this Orientalist eye on everything that is supposed to have been there before we went and touched it with, colonization and white supremacy. It's pretty much where our fascination with the shadow comes from. It's Jung, actually. Jung had this fascination with the shadow because he compared the shadow to the dark, small people from Africa that were still so animal and still, in a way, although so connected to their inner nature. Which is why sometimes I think the shadow has sort of racist origins. I appreciate that we have turned it into something different now, but that was the Orientalist idea of the animalistic and yet innocent side. In a way, look at it like the strength card in tarot, and so it's this domination over the animalistic side. And what is that animalistic side? Everything that hasn't been tamed by colonialism.
It is certainly possible that the fear of a return to a primitive state of mind can be termed archetypal, but for Jung, this became fixed to the external object, to the modern black African, and to the risk he referred to as going black. He filled out the primordial image with the material of the conscious experience, with cultural and personal projections, and used it as a justification for his own fears and fantasies. Unfortunately, he also loaded his conclusions about Africans, Asians, African Americans, and others with all the weight of his influence and of the universality of the archetype. To go black is to go primitive, to go instinctive, which is to go insane, which is to lose his ego, and Jung says to forfeit his authority.
So you can see how this superficial seeming appreciation of the past is actually a simplification and infantilization of every culture that is actually not the Western one. And when we play this game of thinking that every culture before white colonization was this beautiful utopia, we are actually willfully turning a blind eye to the fact that there were hierarchies, there was internal criticism to it, there were marginalized people there, and we don't listen to them because we do not even acknowledge the fact that they were marginalized before colonization by different systems. Before we go into the mess that it is academia and the way that it does not consider lived experience enough, I will leave you with this concept since we're talking about categorization. How do you group people and you make sure that considers everybody experience, but also you do not flatten it into something too simplified. Have you ever noticed how everything that needs to be categorized is never categorized around cis, white, het, maleness? I'll explain it differently. When you hear about the groom gangs here in the UK, you've already thought about people from South Asia, people from the Middle East, people from North Africa, brown people. Haven't you? You know why? Despite the fact that statistically, many, many more white men here in the UK have actually been part and started these grooming gangs. Just look at the Catholic Church. Well, that is because of headlines and what media has decided to focus on, and therefore what you focus on if you don't have the time or interest or attention to listen to anything that are not headlines. I think it's very interesting that the current inquiries that we're having here in the UK, the moment that it's been suggested to open, amplify, extend the research of these grooming gangs into not just brown people.
In 2025, Elon Musk gave international exposure to Oldham, a city of 240,000 inhabitants, 13.5% of whom are of Pakistani origin, north of Manchester in the United Kingdom. The head of Tesla, who is close to Donald Trump, called for the UK government's Under-Secretary of State for Safeguarding and Violence Against Women and Girls, Jess Phillips, to be put in prison for refusing to allow the Home Office to investigate these gangs in Oldham. Musk accused Prime Minister Keir Starmer of being complicit in the rape of the UK.
No, we don't like that. We don't want to find out if there are groomers that are white men. Why? You don't group them that way. This happens with shooters in America as well. Like, statistically, you can absolutely draw that the demographic that does shooting are young, white, cis, het men. But when that is the category and the demographics along which you would have to draw a line and say, that's a bad group, suddenly everybody is a lone wolf. Suddenly everybody has mental health issues. The issue can never be named to be white, cis, het men. But the moment that it's an immigrant, the moment that it's someone that is trans, the moment that it's someone that lives with a trans person, oh, it's that entire category's fault. The entire reason? It's certainly because that entire group is suddenly putting the entire country at risk. Sounds familiar, America? One of the most interesting things to me, I am living baffled by that, is that how long has the Epstein file thing been going on in the US? And every time that a new file is released, people run to it to see who else is named there. As if the only way that you can, draw a line around the people involved is if they are named. As if it cannot be drawn at this point by all the people that already we know have been involved and all the people that have been accused by the survivors. We don't listen to the survivors in that. They give names and we don't listen to them until there's a page with their name. And even with a page with their name is out, we just think that we need a list. we need a clients list. Those are the people, the only people that are at fault. And a disproportionate amount of those people are cis, white, het, rich men. So much so that at this point, if we wanted to draw a demographic of a possible abuser, it would be a cis, white, het, rich man. But we cannot say that. And why is that? And to be extremely clear here, I am not saying the bioessentialist point that every man has the imperative to do harm. I am saying that the system that society has put in place is there to protect cis, white, het, rich men and to incentivize them to do whatever the fuck they want with impunity. Because why else are you gonna pray and suck the cock of capitalism for otherwise, eh?
You are choking on the dick of white supremacy, and I cannot hear you through that mouthful of hypocrisy.
So, you want to talk colonialism? Let's talk colonialism. Let's discuss how empire actually works. I think there's this idea in the West that, I mean, again, this goes back to this kind of Eurocentrism, this white supremacism, that colonialism happened because we were better. Because we just showed up and we had such incredible firepower and such amazing manpower that we dominated the poor brown people around the world, and they couldn't help but be submissive to our superior masculine energy. And I have to say, that's really not the case. I mean, you might have seen Republicans talk every now and then about how when it comes to slavery, when it comes to the slave trade, that it wasn't that white people traveled to Africa and just rounded up all the black people and shipped them to America to be slaves, that they are actually bought from African slavers. And this is done to absolve the West of its sins in slavery, to say, well, we weren't the ones who invented slavery. You know, they offered us slaves and we just couldn't help but to buy them. And there's some great black critique on this mindset, which is to recognize the fact that race, as it currently exists now as a hierarchy of white at the top and black at the bottom, wasn't necessarily a thing quite the same way that it is now.
White identity didn't just spring to life full-blown and unchanging. It had important antecedents that included a growing sense of a pan-European identity, long-standing cultural association that saw white as a symbol of purity and virtue, and bog-standard ethnocentrism. We can say that one of the most crucial developments in the discovery of personal whiteness took place during the second half of the 17th century on the peripheries of the still young British Empire. While xenophobia appears to be fairly universal among human groupings, the invention of a white racial identity was motivated from the start by a need to justify the enslavement of the Africans. In the words of Eric Williams, a historian who later became the first Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, slavery was not born of racism, rather racism was the consequence of slavery.
This does that flattening again by viewing Africa as a one whole continent of people that were all the same. They were all just waiting to be picked up and brought over to America. Ignores the fact that Africa is a continent made up of many different nations, arguably many more nations than existed when we went there and did the colonialism.
The implication is that, because black people share a skin pigmentation or regional origins, they are the same people. At the time of the crime, this could not have been further from the truth. In the same way England, Scotland, Ireland, Japan, China, Korea, etc. have seen each other as rivals. Yoruba, Igbo, Urhobo, Dahomey, Itseriki, Ashanti, Fante, Ga, or any of the hundreds of West African ethnic groups didn't see themselves as fellow black people. A lot of them were rival nations, kingdoms or empires, often warring against each other. European human traffickers, seeking people they could enslave to cultivate the Americas, arrived in Africa and did what they do, kidnapped and trafficked millions of people. Where they did not go on human-snatching rampages, they offered goods, including weapons, in exchange for people.
These are nations that have very strong identities. And when you have nations, you have wars. And so a lot of what facilitated the slave trade to occur was warring African nations with each other, taking prisoners of war, and then white people coming along and saying, hey, perhaps we could buy these off you, we'll put them to good use. Does that actually make it any better? Does that make the West less complicit in this? No, of course it fucking doesn't. But this goes into the very nature of how empire works, of how colonialism is able to function. All these places that were colonized by the French, by the Dutch, by the British, they were only able to do so because they had help. Not the best way to put it, but these places had hierarchies already in place. They had elites. And so what happens is when a colonizing force arrives to a different nation, they make deals with those elites.
Arguably, this is with the exception of Native Americans, which might be the reason why they weren't so much assimilated as other colonized countries, but genocided. As often happened when the Europeans came in contact with Native American populations, the French were impressed with Montagnier Nascapi generosity, their sense of cooperation and indifference to status, but they were scandalized by their lack of morals. They saw that the Nascapi had no conception of private property, of authority, of male superiority, and they even refused to punish their own children. The Jesuits decided to change all that, setting out to teach the Indians the basic elements of civilization, convinced that this was necessary to turn them into reliable trade partners. In this spirit, they first taught them that man is the master. Here is a telling exchange a Jesuit missionary called Lejeune had on this score with a Nascapi man. I told him it was not honorable for a woman to love anyone else except her husband, and that this evil being among them, he himself was not sure that his son, who was present, was his son. He replied, "That was no sense. You French people love only your children, but we love all the children of our tribe." I began to laugh, seeing that he philosophized in horse and mule fashion.
They say to them, hey, if you allow us to help you exploit the people at the bottom of your hierarchy, if you allow us to extract wealth from your nation, we will give you some money for it. We will make you richer. We will make you wealthier. We will bring you into the empire. It's a deal with the devil, but it's a deal that was done. And so you might be asking yourself, like, why would anyone do this? What was actually in it for them to agree to allow these colonizing forces to come in and ravage their land, decimate their people, and extract so much of that wealth? And not to overgeneralize, but the answer is to welcome you into empire. Because if you are one of those elites, if you are the people who are collaborating and coordinating with the colonizing force, that provides certain benefits to you. It provides things like mobility to you, because if you are part of the empire, now you're not just in charge of the people here, but you are invited to travel to other places. You can travel to anywhere else within the empire. You can send your children to be educated at Oxford or Cambridge, and the British will train them in the ways of empire so that you can benefit from the system that is being put in place. The empire will provide the manpower that you need to keep the population that you're trying to subjugate from uprising against you. And if they do uprise against you, they give you an escape route, somewhere to flee to. And I think there's a very good example of this that came up in my Instagram feed recently in disputes between Asian community of London and the black community of London. And this ties back to the exodus of Ugandan Asians from the 70s.
In 1895, the construction of the Uganda Railway began. The Imperial British East Africa Company awarded Ali Bhai Mullah Jivanji, an agent based in Karachi, with the contract to supply the required labour force. Jivanji recruited his workforce from the Punjab region of the British India. The population was later bolstered by Gujarati traders called passenger Indians, both Hindu and Muslim free migrants who came to serve the economy needs of the indentured labour and to capitalize on the economic opportunities. Over time, Indians became prosperous and dominated much of the Ugandan economy, with some acting in the role of colonial overseer for the British regime, which prompted the rise of resentment and Indophobia. This resentment came to a crisis when Idi Amin ousted Milton Obote by military coup d'état in 1971. The following year, Amin ordered the expulsion of Indians from Uganda. As a result, many Indians migrated to the United Kingdom, Canada, the United States, and elsewhere and began rebuilding their lives. Today, Indian Ugandans once again play a dominant role in the country's economy. Despite making up less than 1% of the population, Uganda's Indian community was estimated to be contributing up to 65% of the country's total tax revenue in 2016. Ugandan businessman Sudhir Ruparelia, who is of Indian origin, is the country's richest man, with his net worth standing at approximately $1.2 billion in 2019.
So as part of Britain's efforts to colonize Uganda, they actually outsourced that colonization by using workforce from India, from the Indian colonies. This allowed Indians to travel to Uganda as part of the machine of empire to extract wealth and exploit the people of Uganda to establish themselves as a very solid middle class. When the Ugandan people rose up against the Indians who were there was an exodus from Uganda of the Ugandan Asians to Britain, to the UK. They were materially benefited in participating in the British Empire, in colonialism. This is not just a case of like, oh, the colonized are such victims. Sometimes the colonized become the colonizers. And so we have the perfect example of this in ex-Home Secretary to the Tory party, Priti Patel, whose family were kicked out of Uganda and travelled to the UK. And so you begin to understand why the arguments of, hey, how come Priti Patel, who's from an immigrant background, will be so against immigration? Because she is complicit in empire, because she is a colonialist. She comes from a colonialist family. So this is the game that the West plays. The West sets the rules, and if anyone else wants to participate in the game, they have to play by those rules. They have no choice. So I mentioned about how the elites, how the upper echelons of hierarchy in other societies could send their children to be educated in the UK, in Oxford, in Cambridge. And in doing so, they would be taught under empire. They would be taught the ways of empire to help them to gain more wealth, to establish themselves, to gain power. They are working by the rules that the UK sets. And America does something very similar. When you look at the nations that America has cut ties with, that they've decided those are the ones that are in need of democracy, when there are other nations that have equally vicious human rights violations under their belts, but we decide not to do anything. It's about willingness to work with America, to allow America to extract as much wealth as possible. I mean, just looking at Venezuela, for example, it was one of the richest countries in South America because there was an elite in Venezuela that allowed Americans to extract wealth in exchange for a fraction of what that wealth was worth that would keep them at the top of the hierarchy.
Venezuela was a major oil producer, the fifth largest in the world. Though Venezuelan oil had been nationalized in 1976, the state oil company, the PDVSA, worked in close cooperation with foreign multinationals. The oil interest was a tight nexus binding together Venezuelan state bureaucrats, foreign business executives, and a privileged layer of union bosses and skilled workers. The people in the oil nexus, especially those at the top, grew fantastically rich. Caracas was a more expensive city than Chicago. It had more Cadillacs per head of population. But only 2% of Venezuelans were in the nexus, and the gap between rich and poor was getting wider. The Venezuelan government of Carlos Andrés Pérez had adopted neoliberalism at the height of the fashion in 1989. It had had the same effect as everywhere else. The share of national income going to the richest tenth of the population had jumped from 22% to 33% by the late 1990s. Meantime, the number living below the poverty line had soared from 36% to 66%.
When the communist revolution happens and those that were benefiting from Western exploitation are kicked out, they are welcomed into the empire in exchange for their service. When Prime Minister Mossadegh of Iran in the 50s decided that he wanted to nationalize the oil industry to prevent Western extraction, particularly that of British petroleum at the time, the British, in collaboration with the CIA of America, decided to instigate a coup to remove him from power, reinstall the Shah, and allow that Western extraction of wealth to continue.
The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, a British corporation today known as BP, had been extracting Iranian oil for decades under the terms that were, by any reasonable measure, exploitative. The company's net profits between 1945 and 1950 were almost 3 times the royalties it paid Iran. Mossadegh's proposal was a 50-50 profit split, the same model Venezuela had just successfully negotiated with American oil companies. The British rejected it. In 1951, the Iranian parliament voted to nationalize the oil industry. The crowd chanted Mossadegh's name in the streets. Britain was furious. It imposed an international boycott of Iranian oil, froze Iranian assets, and began planning the regime change. When it couldn't manage alone, it turned to the Americans and played the Cold War card. Mossadegh, they argued, was soft on communism. Iran could fall to the Soviets. The Americans, freshly in the grip of McCarthyite paranoia, bit. President Eisenhower approved the operation in 1953. The CIA, under the operation of Kermit Roosevelt Jr., yes, the grandson of Theodore, ran what became known as Operation Ajax. The operation involved bribing Iranian military officers, funding street demonstrations both for and against Mossadegh to create the impression of chaos, planting disinformation in the Iranian press, and ultimately engineering a military coup. The first attempt failed. Mossadegh got wind of it, and the Shah fled to Rome convinced it was over. Roosevelt, defying a direct CIA order to stand down, pushed on. The second attempt succeeded on August 19, 1953. Mossadegh was arrested, tried for treason, sentenced to house arrest, where he remained until he died in 1967, Iran's first and only democratically elected leader. The Shah was restored to power. American oil companies were cut into the deal alongside the British. And as a condition for putting the Anglo-Iranian oil company back together, the Americans required a breakup of its monopoly. 5 American petroleum companies joined the consortium. Everyone won. Everyone except Iran.
The 1979 revolution in Iran that installed the current regime with the Ayatollah Khomeini was intended to be a response to this wealth extraction. The people who were tired of being subjugated and put down by Western imperialism wanted to rise up and fight back, and unfortunately had their revolution co-opted by religious extremists. At which point, of course, those that were benefiting from that Western extraction, those that were generating the wealth, those that were allowing it, those that were collaborating with empire, those are the ones that were then able to flee. However, all these revolutions, they happened many decades ago. What about the people who have left since then? What about the people who, under these difficult regimes, are suffering? What about the thousands of Venezuelan immigrants that have had to flee because of starvation? What about LGBT Iranians that have fled under the religious extremism of this current regime? Where are those voices? Why can't we hear those? Why is it the monarchists that are dominating the conversation? Why is it every time I see a Channel 4 news report on Iran, I get a man from the Iran Project whose website comes with a giant US flag banner on it? Where are the poor Iranians? Where are the ones who are actually starving? Not the ones that had their position challenged, that had their wealth at risk of being taken away. And that really just comes down to who's allowed to speak? Whose voices do we allow to be elevated? When you see Instagram reels of Venezuelans saying, listen to Venezuelans, what about the Venezuelans that disagree with them? Why aren't we seeing from them? And hey, guess what? That's still empire. The empire still exists. It's much more soft in its power, but it still very much exists. I mean, maybe you have this experience, maybe you don't, but have you ever wondered why sometimes it seems like female doctors are more medically misogynist to you than the male ones? Have you ever wondered why the only trans people who are allowed to speak in gender studies, to be part of queer academia, are the trans men that still acknowledge that they are female? Have you ever wondered why the most famous black and brown people tend to be coming from the conservatives? Have you ever wondered why we've had 3 female prime ministers and they all tend to be conservatives? It's because they are those that are willing to play by the rules of the game, the rules that are written by the hegemony. Because if you don't commit 100% to the empire, if you don't commit 100% to upholding its values, upholding its structures, and providing them with an acceptable face through which to espout their bigotry, you don't get a seat at the table at all. You're not allowed to speak, you'll be silenced. Like, why do you think that we're on YouTube talking about this and not doing a PhD? It's because we don't want to have to deal with academia. Some of the most prominent trans-feminist writers out there are not in the academy. They're not queer academics. Julia Serrano is a biologist. You know, this is a system through which you are excluded unless you commit 100% to play along. I mean, yeah, a perfect example of this is the detransition movement. Have you ever wondered why every single person who detransitions comes out with the same speech, where they talk about how the trans community lied to them, that they groomed them, that they pulled them in, that they made false promises to them about who they could be, that they encouraged their delusions, that the trans doctors just didn't push hard enough. There's not enough scrutiny. Why are they all saying the same thing? It's because there's no support for people who detransition. I mean, just look at my friend Emma. She's ostracized from the detrans community and from the trans community. You know, it would be so easy for her to go, well, you know, I need support, I need help. She currently has a GoFundMe right now for gender affirming care that will link in the description below. But hey, if she wanted to raise that money, she could do so very easily by joining in on the grift. There's lots of money out there and lots of people incentivized to fund these voices above anyone else. And so if you want a seat at the table, if you want to be part of this, if you want to uplift yourself, then you are free to do as we tell you.
So how do we understand, in a situation that feels complex and nuanced, where people supposedly of the same group are infighting, are having completely opposite opinions, how do we evaluate their struggle and where our support will need to go according to our own values? Well, at the present time, most of the Iranian diaspora is basically encouraging and begging American Israel to raise Iran to the ground if necessary, because that way the Islamic regime will be brought down.
What drives Iranian embrace of Israeli genocide? Conventional wisdom attributes Iranian Zionism to oppositional politics. Palestine is the Islamic Republic's cause. Hamas is Tehran's proxy. Therefore, opposing the regime demands supporting Israel. By this logic, Zionist bravados are to be seen as courageous acts of resistance. When 19th century European thinkers racialized the speakers of Indo-European languages as members of the so-called Aryan race, Iranians found themselves reluctantly included. Membership of this white club was never unconditional, yet some Iranian intellectuals seized upon even this grudging inclusion, seeing it as a pathway to claim kinship with their European tormentors, who, in a stunning psychological reversal, became our cousins. What it does is to rhetorically dislodge Iran from its observable reality. Iran, geographically situated in the Middle East, culturally intertwined with Iraq, Turkey, and the Persian Gulf, historically connected to Central Asia and the Indian subcontinent, and predominantly Muslim for well over a millennium, gets reimagined as an Aryan nation, a wayward cousin of the Europeans lost in the wrong neighborhood where the Arab Semites live, the Aryans racial others. The last Shah captured this perfectly when he described Iran's Middle Eastern location as an accident of geography.
And what they're basically saying is, yes, a lot of Iranians in Iran are going to be killed, but it's a sacrifice that I'm willing to make because the bombs are not coming onto my head or onto my children's head. That's the point of the diaspora. They're not there. So anything that they say, they don't pay the consequences for. Okay? It's the same thing with the quote at the beginning. I have trans friends. They are okay with Harry Potter, so surely it's just a nuance thing. I don't need to take a stance on it. I'll just go ahead with what I was planning, ignoring that there is an issue there, because I can't stand for either. Some trans people like Harry Potter, some trans people are against it. I'm just gonna do nothing and stand in the middle still and just do my own thing. Except that inaction actually is taking a stance. Basically, how do you analyze a situation and understand what people are actually gaining or losing? Because that's, at the end of the day, the most simple, basic way in which you literally can see what do you stand to gain, what do you stand to lose from this. And somebody from the Iranian diaspora living in New York, they only have to gain that, the country that they had to flee, and what did they have to flee? The country that they fled is liberated, and potentially, if they feel like it, they can go back. Which sounds awfully similar to what a lot of Israeli people with double citizenship living, in London say. Oh no, if I am displeased by here, I can always go to Israel. How lucky of you, eh, to have two places to choose, while Palestinians have been systematically genocided for the last 70 years, so that you can have a holiday home in Israel, hey? Fuck. Or hey, maybe if you're Iranian diaspora and you want the Shah back, because you have supported them, the moment that the Shah will be back in power, will give you a position of power too. And maybe you will be elevated compared to the Iranian populace that will, at that point, will be below you. It's always a matter of interest. And are you serving your own individual interest, or are you moving towards the liberation of the people that share your condition? Going back to choice feminism, that was exactly the point. Like, sometimes, most of the time, choice feminism simply means that you try to erase collective liberation claiming that a choice of a woman, even when it is about being oppressed, it's valid for that. And by doing that oppression, you actually enable other women to be oppressed the same way. A stark example in recent times was the trad wife ballerina on TikTok, which was something heartbreaking for feminism because it's just encouraging and enabling abuse, telling women that actually abuse is love. And as someone that has been raised on that fairy tale, it's heartbreaking to see the way that it's still sold, that the best thing that could possibly happen to you is to give up all the years that you've studied and to give up your career to be locked away in a farm that nobody can reach with 13 children, keeping popping them out, with no nannies around, so that you can raise the children of the man that decided to choose you. May the mother crone, hey? When you analyze who's winning and who's gaining, you start to understand at the same time who is asked for a sacrifice, who is losing part of their identity, who is losing part of what they have just so that the other can gain. And this leveling also tells you at which point can people survive still. Because if you're already surviving and you just want to gain on top of that, it starts to be easier to see on which side to side with. Because basic survival should be a given. We should protect everybody's life. No, on top of the people killed by the Islamic regime, let's kill some more with bombs. And let's see how many we need to kill in total so that finally I can go back home. In the case of the video with Angela Pucca and this content creator being confronted with Angela's double down on transphobia despite claiming, no, I love Harry Potter, I share Harry Potter, I'm proud of Harry Potter. Literal words from Angela, supporting Harry Potter does not mean to support J.K. Rowling. And J.K. Rowling usually replied, no, I use every penny to actually make the life of trans people impossible. So listen to people, but also observe to the actual effects of things. And at this point, Angela can say all she wants, that she's in a lie. Facts are directly in conflict with what she says. She is acting as a transphobe. She is enabling transphobes. So I don't quite care what she says. I observe and I name consequentially to that. So when someone wants to do a collaboration with Angela and sort of starts to smell that, could I be implicated in something that could call me a transphobe? I wouldn't like that much, but do I have enough reasonable doubt on my side? I confronted this person. I explained to them the story, and their reply was, I can defend myself by saying some of my trans friends are okay with Harry Potter, so it's fine. I'm going to publish this. Why? Because what do they have to gain? They publish a collaboration with Angela, who had more subscribers than they had. This person wanted to make YouTube their day job, so it was in their absolute interest to collaborate with Angela because they would have been exposed to more people. In the social media economy, attention basically equates money, so I completely understand what they had to gain. What did they decide to sacrifice for that? Trans people. They don't have skin in the game. They just decided to go for what was in their interest rather than what could have been maybe morally right, and they decided to play on reasonable doubt, saying, I have some friends that say that they are okay. To which, if you ever hear that, I would always wonder, do you have friends that are trans? Do you have friends that are people of color and tell you that, no, your racism is fine? Or are you around people and you have power over them, so much so that they don't feel comfortable to let you know that you're being really inappropriate? Just food for thought. Do these people whose marginalization you use to shield your choices feel safe around you to tell you those are bad choices? Because if you hold power over them, it's not exactly a position that they can afford to tell you you're being a bitch. So in the end, despite this very clear discussion done in public, so other content creators saw this exchange, they decided to publish their video with Angela. And I was like, okay, you made your choice. My choice will be to unfollow you, but that's fine, you know, but we had a discussion. A month later, because in this group there are very big Witchtubers, a very, very, very big Witchtuber sees the discussion that's been going on, sees the information that I've shared, the screenshots of how Angela like keeps going on yay Harry Potter, and they're like, oh, that's so fucked up. I did a video years ago with Angela, let me take it down. And if I needed confirmation that the person the original quote is by was ill-intentioned, well, what do you know? I had my confirmation after that. When this bigger Witchtuber decides to remove their video with Angela, this person, who after our conversation instead had published their video with Angela, came to find me in my DMs and tried to my face to gaslight me and tell me, oh, did Angela never apologize for that? Because that's why I still uploaded the video. I thought she would have apologized. Within a week, after I have told you and given you screenshots of Angela being a repeat offender over 2 years and completely always denying any wrongdoing, you thought that after 2 years of doing that, Angela, in the 5 days before you published your video with her, would have come to apologize to me. And that's why you uploaded the video. But now that this bigger Witchtuber has deleted their video with Angela, you go and silently make yours disappear. So you gained what you needed from that, you got some views, and then you did not want to pay the consequences of that, so you silently made this video disappear. At no point trans people were ever on your mind, because you spoke directly with trans people and you shut them up using a token trans friend to tell them, it's fine. So that, in a nutshell, is how you ruin identity politics. How do you do it right? You need to bring the two things together. What does it mean? You ask yourself questions about a context, a situation that you're looking at, and you're like, who's gaining from this? Who's losing from this? Who has more to lose and who has more to gain? And at which point is survival involved in this? And as you can see, crazy as it sounds, it applies to using trans people as tokens to publish a video that will bring you views, and it applies the same way if you extend it to the Iranian diaspora, because both this Witchtuber and the Iranian diaspora really have nothing to lose, but they wanted to gain something. In the case of the Witchtuber, they want to gain more views. What they have is not enough, they need more, they need growth. And the Iranian diaspora, what they want, despite their safe life now, is, no, I want the regime to come back, and no matter how many people get killed through that, if I want, I could go also back home. I already have a place that is safe, but I need people in Iran to be killed if necessary, so that I can also go back to Iran, if I so choose. When survival is brought in, you start to see where the point of need and support comes in. And so, my best advice for any situation where you as a white progressive person are like, ooh, I'm not gonna touch this because surely I'm gonna get it wrong and somebody's gonna call me a racist. Can you stop being a little pussy? And can you use your privilege maybe to actually support the people that are actually losing? You will be told off anyway, so you might as well stand up for the little guys. So I still think the lived experience is very, very important. To the lived experience, then you need to start asking questions that come from a context, from a framework. So when you hear diaspora Iranian tell you, oh no, you need to listen to my experience because I live there and I can no longer be there. And rightfully right now you can't quite hear the opinion of people in Iran because they can't quite get information out. And you're just listening to them. And what do they want? They want to go back to Iran. They want the king to be back there and possibly to be looked kindly upon by said king, because that way they will get an advantage once they are back. And what do the Iranian people currently in Iran want? Maybe not to have their children bombed and killed. What is the level of survival there? I'd like to also go back to my hometown if I can at some point. I'd like to wake up tomorrow. Who needs more help right now? I hope that helps. And as always, I really hope that until the next video we can hex the patriarchy together and use a tiny bit of critical thinking, because I think there's very much need for it.